The impact of the Endangered Species Act. Since its establishment during the Nixon Administration in 1973, interpretation of the Endangered Species Act has evolved. I'm Tom Stever. In this edition of the Missouri Soybean Spotlight podcast, we'll talk to a specialist about the Act's history and how to navigate the ESA.
My name is Kaitlin Flick-Dinsmore, and I serve as a technical conservation agronomist for the Missouri Soybean Merchandising Council.
And we're here today to talk about the Endangered Species Act. What is the Endangered Species Act?
Great question, Tom. So the Endangered Species Act was established in 1973, and it establishes the protection for fish, wildlife, and plants that are listed as threatened or endangered. The Endangered Species Act was also designed to require different federal agencies to ensure that actions taken or permitted by federal government will not jeopardize the continued existence of a listed species, or that it would result in a modification to the critical habitat. So what that means, Tom, is when a government agency is going to take action and complete a project, for example, right? Like say they're going to work on a bridge or on the road or whatever it might be, that they have to make sure that no endangered species that are listed or their critical habitat could be impacted by that action. Although the Endangered Species Act has been around since 1973, we hear a lot more about it now in agriculture and specifically within the last 1 to 2 years. And the reason is because non-governmental groups, environmental groups, they got together and they sued the EPA because the EPA did not do a thorough consultation with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife. So under the Endangered Species Act, when a government agency is going to register or re-register a pesticide, like how the EPA would be doing this, they have an obligation to consult with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services on how this would impact the species or a species critical habitat. They were not doing the consultation process with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife up to par, and the environmental groups sued EPA over it. So there were several mega lawsuits. And as a result of the lawsuits, the EPA has established the Endangered Species Act strategies, the herbicide strategy, insecticide strategy, fungicide strategy, vulnerable species action plan. And it's part of the settlement with the ESA mega lawsuit saying that we will now work more diligently with the consultation process with U.S. Fish and Wildlife when we register or go through the re-registration of a pesticide. Because of that, we have new strategies coming out: herbicide strategy, insecticide strategy, fungicide strategy. And really, these strategies are built around different frameworks that identify the population level impacts, which mitigation practices would apply, which type and level of mitigation is needed per each species or their critical habitat, and then identifying the geographical extent of mitigation that's needed for where those species are located at in a geographical area.
Kaitlin, this takes us back to the Nixon administration when this was first established. So how has the Act itself evolved in those decades?
That's a good question, and I cannot answer how it was in the 1970s. I will say we are hearing more chatter about it now because of media attention the lawsuits have gotten, because of the lawsuits from environmental groups suing EPA. This is something that has been around, right, like you said, since the Nixon administration. When I talk to several of my family members who have been farmers for years, they have mentioned this is not something we'd heard a lot about in the agriculture community in the 70s, 80s, and even the 90s. It's been more within the last several years. As far as how it has evolved, Tom, I'll be honest, I don't know what the legislation looked like originally. It's my understanding that the legislation was brought forth to protect larger animals, mammals. It wasn't necessarily designed to protect some of the smaller species that we're seeing it's focused on now in 2025. But through even the last 12 months, the ESA has evolved by the EPA saying that they are going to work more diligently with U.S. Fish and Wildlife. We've also had different strategies released specifically to herbicide, insecticide, fungicide, and rodenticide. So we have had a herbicide strategy released and an insecticide strategy released, which has requirements in there that pesticide labels, either herbicide or insecticide labels, would have to follow, right? They would have required language on the pesticide label referring to what needs to be done, what actions, what field practices need to be completed to use that product on that field. So, to answer that question a little more directly, the way that the Endangered Species Act has progressed over the last several years would be that in the last 12 to 24 months, it's become a little more known in the media and known in agriculture what we have to do to use these pesticide products that are now having to comply with the Endangered Species Act on a little more of a rigorous process, right? Because the EPA is taking an action to do their consultations with U.S. Fish and Wildlife and to make sure that these pesticide products are not contaminating a critical habitat. They're not impacting a species or potentially impacting the species habitat, which would then impact the species itself. So there is information on those herbicide strategies, insecticide strategy. We have not seen the fungicide strategy yet. Those strategies itself specifically lay out criteria that is to be used when registering a pesticide product. That if you are going to register a new herbicide, it needs to reflect the herbicide strategy and it needs to comply with the herbicide strategy. That will be taken into account when a pesticide is registered, and you will have to use the mitigation requirements on there.
What makes the Endangered Species Act relevant to farmers today?
That's a great question and a very important question. So, what makes the Endangered Species Act relevant to farmers today here in June of 2025 would be that different products coming out will need to go through the Endangered Species Act language on the label. So, right now, for example, we're seeing with the herbicide product Liberty Ultra. Liberty Ultra is that higher concentration of Liberty glufosinate, and we are seeing the Liberty Ultra label have Endangered Species Act requirements on it. So to use that product, you are required to have mitigation points. You're required to abide by a certain buffer distance. Now, there are different practices you can do to get those mitigation points or to reduce that buffer strip that could be needed. You would go to the EPA mitigation menu to look at that. That would have more information about what you are required to do for spray drift buffers and for runoff and erosion mitigation practices. But that's why it's relevant. As we see more products brought to the market as either new products or simply going through the re-registration process as a current product or active ingredient, we will see label information about how this product is to be used to comply with the Endangered Species Act. Farmers will be given mitigation points needed to use that specific product. Now, 9 points is the maximum that they could need for either a herbicide or an insecticide. The Liberty Ultra label itself is requiring 3 mitigation points. There are several practices that are very attainable for Missouri farmers to do if they are not already participating in to reach those 3 mitigation points. It also requires certain buffer distances for aerial and ground application. So all of that information can be found on the EPA website. You're also always welcome to directly reach out to myself or anyone at Missouri Soy that can put you in contact with me, and we can walk through your field operation, field by field, on what you would need to do to stay in compliance.
You mentioned lawsuits against the EPA regarding the Endangered Species Act. What is hoped to be accomplished through these lawsuits?
Good question. Truly, the environmental organizations who sued the EPA, I cannot speak for what their motive was. We all have assumptions, but we know within the agriculture community, pesticides are a great tool in our toolbox to control weeds, diseases, and insects that have economic impacts to our crops and our livelihood. So it's important that we work with the EPA, that we help them understand the practices that we're using on our operations to help protect species and their habitat. Farmers are the best conservationists out there. We want to protect these species and their habitats. We want to protect pollinators. We want to keep our water clean and our air clean. It's true. So it's important that we are willing to meet with EPA and sit at the table and say, what do you need from us? What are achievable economic practices that we can implement if we're not already doing these practices to help protect the species?
Kaitlin, what's changing about the Endangered Species Act? In other words, what should farmers be looking for as far as anticipated changes in the Endangered Species Act?
Yep.
And indeed, if there are
Yep.
any.
Sure. So farmers will be hearing more communication in the next months and even years about different products that are coming to market, different active ingredients that are going through the re-registration process or the registration process, and what practices are going to be required to have on their fields to use those products. So farmers can expect to hear more communication on what practices they need to have on a field by field case to use these different pesticides. And when I say what practices, that can be as simple as dry land soybean fields. That gives you 3 points on the mitigation pick list, and that would satisfy the 3 point mitigation requirement for the Liberty Ultra label. For an example, some other mitigation options are terraces. Different field slopes have mitigation points associated with it, soil types, field borders, filter strips, etc. Working with the certified crop advisor on different conservation programs or pest management plans, those all have mitigation points associated with it. So truly, a lot of these mitigation points that are required are practices or just field characteristics that are already implemented in Missouri.
You're representing soybean growers. Kaitlin, how are soybean growers specifically impacted by the Endangered Species Act?
Soybean growers specifically are impacted by the Endangered Species Act by having one of their biggest tools in their toolbox, Liberty Ultra herbicide, going through the ESA language. So it will say on the Liberty Ultra label different mitigation points that you need. So Missouri soybean growers are impacted because they are already seeing their pesticide products for soybeans have Endangered Species Act language on the label, which would then require them to look at the mitigation points needed, look at the buffer strips needed, and to comply with that.
In your view, what do you see in the coming years for those who are feeling the impact of the Endangered Species Act?
In the next coming years, I am hopeful we can continue to work with EPA on having mitigation points available to us with practices that are achievable at the farm gate level and also economical to implement. I think I know we will continue to see more pesticides with Endangered Species Act information on the label. This is not going to go away. We're going to have more complexity as we have more products that will have ESA language on there. And for example, you have a tank mix with 3 or 4 different herbicides with an insecticide. They will all have different mitigation points needed to satisfy each product. Now, there will not be anything over 9. So it would be the highest mitigation point per product will satisfy for all the products. So if one's 2, one's 4, and one's 7, you would not add them. It would just take the 7. It's going to get more complex as we add more products that have Endangered Species Act information on the label. Here at Missouri Soy, that's what we're here to help with. We're here to help growers understand what they need to do to comply, what fields need to have different mitigation points and the buffer strips associated with that product. And we're here to just help educate and share what we know with what's going on with the Endangered Species Act to growers so they can stay in compliance and we can help simplify this complex process.
Those are the questions I have. Is there anything that I left out that you would like to add to this?
So the herbicide strategy, we had that developed in the fall of 2024, and the insecticide strategy just came out in the spring of 2025. And per the herbicide and insecticide strategy, they talk about different mitigation points needed to use specific products. They have both promised not to exceed a 9 mitigation point system. So if you are using a herbicide and an insecticide with it, 9 would be the top mitigation points you would need. Now, the buffer strip requirements are a little different. Refer to the website to look at all of the EPA mitigation pick list and buffer strip requirements. But that is going to be a great resource that we have a threshold that we know that we will not exceed 9 points. As farmers are looking at Liberty Ultras requiring them to have a 3 mitigation point system for their fields to use Liberty Ultra, if they already can determine that they have 9 mitigation points, that would satisfy any herbicide or insecticide label that could come out in the future. Because the next pesticide product that might go through the ESA language requirements could have 6 or 7. Well, if you're already at that 9 mitigation points for your fields, you're covered.
Just momentarily, I would like to
Yeah.
ask you about the numerical value that you're placing on mitigation points. What are some of the mitigation points to be covered here?
Yeah, absolutely. So the mitigation menu that you can find on the EPA website gives you different practices and they have a numerical value associated with them. So for example, if you are using a cover crop, that will give you either 1 to 2 to 3 points, depending on if it's a long-term or a short-term cover crop and the tillage associated with it. If you have grassed waterways, that's 2 mitigation points associated with having grass waterways in that field. If you are working with a certified crop advisor or you are enrolled in a conservation program, that has a point value associated with it. There's additional point values associated with the field slope, the topography of the field, and the soil type of the field. Record keeping is another point as well, and even dry land soybeans. So in Missouri, if you have a dry land soybean field, that satisfies 3 mitigation points. Therefore, that is the same number required for the Liberty Ultra label, and you're good. I'll talk a little bit about spray buffers. So when you go to the pesticide label and you look under the Endangered Species Act requirements, it's going to tell you that there are runoff erosion mitigation points needed. That's what you'd go to the mitigation menu to look at those different practices. It's also going to tell you about the spray drift buffers needed. And there are different practices you can do to reduce the spray drift buffer needed. So the spray drift buffers needed for the Liberty Ultra is 10 feet for a ground application and 50 feet for an aerial application. A few things you can do to reduce the buffer distance needed is the amount of passes you're going to make, the type of sprayer you're using, the coarse droplet distribution size, the boom height. Those all have a reduction in buffer percent associated with it. Now that is additive, so you can add those up and you can eventually get down to perhaps 100% reduction off that 10-foot needed or a 50% reduction off the 5 feet needed for the Liberty Ultra label. So there are drift buffers required for Liberty Ultra. There are practices you can do depending on the passes you make, the sprayer type, the coarse droplet distribution size, and the boom height to help reduce that buffer distance needed. So when you look at the pesticide label, you're going to see the runoff erosion mitigation points needed for that product, the spray drift buffer distance for aerial and ground, and then you will see information about referring to the pesticide use limitation area. We call this a PULA for short, and there is a website called Bulletins Live 2. Bulletins Live 2 was designed to be like an actual bulletin that you would look at, but it is now online and it has pesticide use limitation areas. You need to check that 6 months prior to using that pesticide product to make sure you are not specifically in an area that the product would not have more mitigation points required, or if it's in a restricted use area. So online, you would go to Bulletins Live 2. It's a map. You would put in your county, your coordinates, your address, whatever you need to do to find the field on that map and see if you're in what we would call a red or a pink zone on that map, where you would be in a restricted use area for that pesticide, or if there are more mitigation points associated. You have to do that 6 months before using that product and document that you are not in a pesticide use limitation area. Right now, Liberty Ultra does not have a pesticide use limitation area in Missouri.
You've brought up Liberty Ultra many times now. Is that pretty much the primary crop protection product that is affected by the ESA?
Sure. Yes, I've brought up Liberty Ultra because it's the most relevant product for soybean farmers to relate the Endangered Species Act to. There will be more products that we will be able to educate about, but they have not gone through the re-registration or registration of that active ingredient yet to have ESA language. So Liberty Ultra is the herbicide right now that has ESA language on it that this is applicable to. For a traditional grain crop system, we have not seen many other products impacted by this yet. The only thing I'll add, and you can just use this wherever you see suitable, is when I talk about the spray drift buffers are to be used as buffers that are downwind only and are to protect an unmanaged area. So there's different classifications of properties, field boundaries, and things next to fields that are categorized as managed or unmanaged. And so a managed area would be another agriculture field that connects to the field, a road, a mowed area. Those can all be included in a spray drift buffer. That gives a little leeway with what is needed when we talk about these spray drift buffer distances. If you are next to a road, a mowed area, another agriculture field, that can be used.
Very good. Thank you.
Take care. Thanks, Tom.
Kaitlin Flick-Dinsmore is a technical conservation agronomist with Missouri Soybeans. The Missouri Soybean Spotlight podcast is brought to you by Missouri soybean farmers and their checkoff. We are also on the air with the weekly Spotlight on Soybeans. Thank you for listening. I'm Tom Stever.